Alrighty, we're going to get started on another discussion of argumentation um, here for this new topic coming up in January, February, which states resolved. States ought to ban lethal autonomous weapons. On this point, we are now moving on to the negative side. This is going to be definitely a lot more we're going to have a lot less arguments than we have for the affirmative. In fact, we presented 8, I believe, for the affirmative. In this negative side, we're only going to be bringing up 4, not 2, but just at half. So definitely a lot less to talk about. But that's honestly because there's just a lot less influential arguments on the negative side for this topic than for the affirmative, I think, as is generally the case, as there's a lot more arguments to be ran on the affirmative. But either way, we're going to get right into it. As always, our structure will not be changing from the affirmative to the negative. We're going to start by talking about the basic idea behind the argument, and then we will move on to the framework, then rebuttals, and lastly, closing with my general thoughts on the argument. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. So, this argument is one that I actually think is relatively simple. And it's this idea that having soldiers on the ground is not good. Remember that whenever we are discussing this, now that we are on the negative, we're saying that lethal autonomous weapons are good. So the idea here is less about praising lethal autonomous weapons, but about trying to say that having soldiers is in nations is bad. And the general idea behind this specific one is this idea of that soldiers commit a lot of war crimes. So this is obviously a disadvantage if you see my disadvantage lecture. So kind of structuring this pretty easily is that currently uniqueness is we this is a tough one because it's the whole point of most disadvantages is that the neg is protecting the status quo, and we're kind of doing that here, but there aren't lethal autonomous weapons yet. So we'll say that uniqueness is that currently soldiers are committing a lot of war crimes. Specifically, we can see things such as rape and killing of innocents and those types of things. And then our link is going to be that if we have lethal autonomous weapons, we can stop having soldiers be in these nations because lethal autonomous weapons are going to lead to less necessity for soldiers, just inherently. And then obviously the impact is that we are reducing these big issues. So no longer, since the soldiers aren't there, are we going to be seeing these civilian casualties or these rapings or those types of big ideas. But yeah, it really doesn't go too much deeper than that. The only real thing you have to prove is that A, these things are happening, and B, that soldiers are going to obviously be taken out of these cities and countries if we have lethal autonomous weapons. You also have to someone might argue that you have to prove that we're going to see lethal autonomous weapons. Because since we haven't seen it yet, then they could argue that's never going to happen. But then that's gonna pretty much just undermine all affirmative arguments anyway. Because it's if lethal autonomous weapons are never going to happen, why vote AF or neg? Unless you're just voting AF out of principle, in which case okay, good for you. So I don't really think that's gonna be an issue. But I am so I've been doing this long enough to I know that some people run just the worst and stupidest arguments imaginable. So I could see that. So maybe be prepared for arguments on that front. But otherwise, there's really not too much else to explain on this. So let's move on to just general frameworks. I think, as always, consequentialism, the Venn type is going to work on this one. I think a quality of life one could possibly be okay because obviously you're not necessarily going to get actual deaths from some of these because I think rape is going to be one of the bigger impacts. Obviously civilian casualties is going to be a bad one, but there's a lot of rapings that go on, so there's going to be a lot of evidence to talk about that. And also, that's although it's not death, some people would argue that that's a lot higher of an impact. It's a fate worse than death. So and even if you don't believe that, it's still a really bad point. So there's a really good impact there. So even though it's not quite the consequentialist of life, you can still hit quality of life and get your main points in. Otherwise, you could do. I'm curious if you could if you really wanted to, you could probably spin this to an oppression argument and talk about how this only happens in like poor countries. So like, well, not it's not even. I guess it's less about like the wealth of the nations, and it's just like you're seeing it in like the Middle East and stuff. So you could talk about like oppression of those groups. I don't really think that's overly strong, but I suppose you can see it if you really want to go with like an oppression case. Maybe it's because it generally fits one of your other contentions. Um, I just generally think that like consequentialism is what's good here because the whole point is you want to really be able to leverage those like super high magnitude impacts, and promoting consequentialism is the only way you're going to be able to like those impacts are going to matter, right? Because you definitely want to win on a consequentialist framework if you're running this argument. Like this still fulfills the deontological framework because obviously like these actions are bad, and if we can allow them, if we can like stop them, then that's good. But it's going to be a lot better if you can actually just weigh on the impacts above all else. So that would be the good thing on that front. As for the actual like responses to this, I think obviously you can have a deny in there, which is that saying that like we're not necessarily going to have less soldiers on the ground from having lethal autonomous weapons. You can just say we're going to have more weapons, like, and that's not going to really change anything. I'm torn on this because I think you might be able to like convince judges of that. I'm not overly convinced by it because I think it's just blatantly untrue. Like I think we've seen with drone strikes that we've had less like actual human interaction in these areas, so then you could argue that like that's still going to happen. But then again, like soldiers are probably still going to be stationed in these areas, even if they're not like walking around and like actually go. I'm not walking around, but if they're not actually in combat, so it's like they're still going to have the ability to just probably go and like still commit these quote unquote war crimes to a lesser extent because like that's like I said, that's what most of rapings happen from. So maybe you can hit something on there where it's like they're not going to be less people stationed. They're just going to be less of them actually in combat. And then maybe you could even do that with a turn and being like, since they're not in combat, like it's going to be easier for them to commit these awful war crimes. That's a bit of a stretch, and I don't know if I would believe that point. Um, but like it's definitely out there. Otherwise, like I don't really think there's much you can do with the impact. I think the impact is pretty strong on this. The uniqueness is also very strong because like this thing just does happen. Like you can't prove that there's not rapings. Um, Personally, I don't really think there's too much more to say on the rebuttals. I think you just have to prove that's not actually going to change the issue at all. So like, really got to have some evidence to support that. This is one that you definitely should have blocked out. As for my personal thoughts on the argument, I love this one. This one's super great. Like I've been singing its praises the entire time, so I feel like I don't have too much more else to say. But like I said, the impacts are amazing. They're very high magnitude and very believable. I think the only potential downside to this argument is, at least for where I'm debating, ragging on the military. I should not use the term ragging on for to talk about them doing like war crimes, but like criticizing the military. Sometimes that's a very bold choice in Missouri. Like every other judge that we have is going to have been in the military at some point, but I feel like most of them would be pretty like understanding and would say that this argument like kind of stands. Hopefully, at least. Um, I don't think we're going to have too much of an issue on that front, but you might have a judge or two who feels that way. In which case, that's really unfortunate. But you do what you got to do. Um, but yeah, overall, I think this argument's great. I think the impacts are strong. I think that the warrants are definitely believable. I don't think you're going to have a whole lot of issues if you choose to run this one, and I would really recommend for novice to run this one, or just like even varsity. I think it's strong. I think it's going to do well in varsity or even champ rounds. Um, but otherwise, I don't really think there's too much more to say on the note of this one. I think it's pretty like straightforward once you get the idea of like soldiers being on the ground. I don't think there's really too much more else to say. So, as always, I hope this video was educational, and I wish you guys good luck in all of your rounds.